So since I last talked to you guys, my project has sort of taken a more narrowed scope focus. And instead of talking about things on a national level, I'm going to look really specifically at the state of Tennessee, because I uncovered some really interesting legislation that's surfaced in the past year, really very recently, that sort of points to an interesting attitude towards sexuality education. The first piece of legislation that I thought was really interesting is one that prohibits the teaching of what they call gateway sexual activity in public schools. It's sort of unclear what they really think this gateway sexual activity is. It could go anywhere from holding hands to any other sort of sexual contact that is not intercourse. But regardless, they can't mention any kind of this activity in public schools. And further, although Tennessee already centered on an abstinence-only focused sex education method, there is now explicitly written in the law that they have to emphatically and exclusively talk about abstinence as the only effective method of contraception. This goes so far as if an outside speaker comes into a school and starts talking about what someone perceives as gateway sexual activity in a classroom, that they can be fined $500 and punished by the legal system. Another interesting law that I've talked to you guys about before that surfaced very recently is what they've been calling this Don't Say Gay legislation. This did not actually pass, but it got really far and played a really big part in the conversation that's been happening in the state recently. What this legislation would have done was prohibited the discussion of any kind of sexual orientation in public elementary and middle schools other than heterosexuality, in any context, in any way, at all. So what we see in this state is this really interesting attitude of silence, of a withdrawal, of a clear barrier between sexuality and sex and school. And so I sort of started thinking, what does this legislation mean? What does this indicate? What can we learn from it? And what is the real problem at hand? So a few questions came to mind. The first of which was, what problems is this legislation trying to fix? Because all legislation is trying to fix some sort of greater problem. And it seems as if the biggest, most clear answer, after you look at what all the proponents of this legislation say, is that they're struggling with the family versus school dynamic. All of these lawmakers and all of the proponents of this legislation are saying there are things that should be discussed at home and there are things that should be discussed at school. And sex and sexuality should stay at home and be the responsibility of the family. And that the conversation should not be happening at school. But what I thought was interesting about this was that this truly becomes a clear oversimplification of the real problem at hand. This is a response that's a response to a real problem, and the real problem is silence. The real problem is the conversation isn't happening. And when we started to realize this in the past couple of years, people started trying to introduce these things to our schools. And when that happened, this backlash was what occurred. States like Tennessee said, we don't want this in our school, and this conversation shouldn't be happening. But the fact that the conversation isn't happening is the real problem. So it's this vicious circle of this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. The second question is, what are the effects of this legislation then, if it's sort of misrepresenting the real problem? And a great example, and a very unfortunate one, I found was a young boy named Philip Parker, who at the beginning of this year, at the age of 14, took his own life. And he lived in Tennessee, and the media coverage of this was very clearly, had one argument, which was the problem was school. His mother was really supportive. His family had no idea what was going on. He was openly gay and his mom accepted him, but every day at school was a struggle for him. He woke up every morning, and like some of us have some mornings where we wake up and we don't want to get out of bed, every morning was like that for this 14-year-old boy. And he went to school, and it didn't get better, it got worse. And eventually, he felt so alone and so isolated and ignored that the only solution he saw was to take his own life. And it seems clear to me that the problem here is the silence. The problem isn't that too many people talked to him about being homosexual when he was younger and it drove him to do this. The problem was that no one was paying attention to him and no one was talking to him at school. The administrators ignored it and really didn't notice it. Teachers sort of turned a blind eye, and this was the result. So the third question I have then is there a better solution? This problem that is clearly significant, students' lives are at stake. Whether it be this student who took his own life, or a student who becomes pregnant at a very young age and the course of her life totally changes, or any kind of illnesses that can be contracted from sexual contact? Is there a better solution than just not talking about it? And I actually found several ways that we can implement more successful solutions. The first of which is called Project 10, which actually happened in Los Angeles, which is, you would expect it to happen in LA, certainly more than Tennessee, but I think that there's a lot to be learned from Project 10. What it was it began experimentally in the 1980s and has now been pretty heartily implemented in the school district as a whole. What it was a school-based intervention program for issues for LGBTQ students. It implemented an intervention system that targeted both LGBTQ students specifically and the student body as a whole to help them feel more prepared and more equipped to deal with these issues. Studies have shown overwhelmingly that Project 10 was very successful, that the students themselves who had before felt depressed and isolated now felt safe, supported, and happier, and that the students around them were not targeting them as strongly and felt much more comfortable, and there were fewer instances of aggressive bullying. The second is sex education. What's interesting is if you ask these Tennessee lawmakers how they feel like their abstinence-only sex education is going, they'll say it's going very well. Because after they implemented it, the rates of teen pregnancy and other issues declined significantly. But to me, that's an argument for my stance, which is that any conversation is better than no conversation. So if we go from nothing to some sex ed, of course the problem will get better. But I would argue that if we then implement inclusive sex ed that includes contraception and other ideas of like homosexuality and things like that, then it will continue to get better, because the more conversation, the better. And we should have an open forum for these kids who feel alone, isolated, and bullied. Thirdly, I found this really great set of national standards that was put together by several reputable organizations, including the American Association for Health Education, that outlined grade by grade what students should be learning as they progress through school. For example, by 5th grade, by these standards, students should be able to identify what sexual orientation is, point out people in their life with whom they can talk about the subject, and feel well educated in the idea of respecting others based on different sexual orientations. Similarly, it outlines things for understandings of reproduction and other kinds of sex, I think we all sort of started our sex education when we were in like kindergarten, 1st grade, and it outlines very clearly what we should know by then, both physically, anatomically, scientifically, and emotionally, about relationships, about respect, and all of those things. And I think that we can really learn a lot from the fact that this isn't actually, we can't implement this on a national level, but states like Tennessee can really learn a lot from these standards. So essentially, I think it's really important that this conversation take place. And I think that Tennessee is a great example of what happens when it doesn't. And it truly provides a really great case study for why people are arguing for silence. Because it seems as if there's a surface level problem, but if we dig a little deeper, a much deeper problem sort of becomes clear. And I think if we really look at that problem and try to find solutions to the real problem, that we'll find happier students and, in general, just a stronger student body and a stronger society as a whole. So that's it.